January 1945. A brittle wind swept across the English countryside, carrying the faint tang of coal smoke and wet earth. The snow was thin, patchy, revealing mud streaked with footprints of boots and sleds. In the shadow of a barbed wire enclosure, a group of German women posed shuffled forward, their coats threadbare, their eyes wide and unguarded. Their breaths rose in pale clouds, trembling in the cold dot at the gate. British soldiers waited uniformed, disciplined, yet calm, their boots crunching over frozen ground. Some were young, barely men in age, with a faint humor in their posture. Others hardened by years of war, eyes sharp and watchful. The women hesitated. A few glanced at one another, a mix of fear, curiosity, and something undefinable flashing in their expressions. It was an ordinary morning at a British POW camp, yet for these women, it felt disorienting. They had crossed borders, survived bombings, and endured capture. Now, standing before men they had never imagined meeting strangers, yet commanding attention that could not stop the subtle flushes on their faces, betraying emotions they scarcely understood. In that moment, the war's human dimension became unmistakably intimate, a quiet tension ready to unfold. By late 1944, the tides of war were shifting across Europe. The Allies had landed in Normandy months earlier, and German forces were increasingly pressed along multiple fronts. Cities lay in rubble, supply lines were strained, and every encounter, every skirmish, carried human consequences far beyond the battlefield. It was into this fractured world that German civilians, men, women, and sometimes children were drawn, either by conscription, circumstance, or capture. Among those captured were women attached to the German war effort in various capacities: auxiliary personnel, nurses, administrative staff. Their capture, though not as widely documented as that of male soldiers, became an undeniable reality of total war. POW camps in Britain, established since 1940, had steadily grown in population. By early 1945, these camps housed thousands, ranging from frontline soldiers to non-combatants, segregated where possible by age, gender, and rank. The British approach to POW management was grounded in law and pragmatism. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided strict guidelines. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, protected from violence, given adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Officers were generally accorded privileges. Civilians and auxiliaries were subject to strict routines designed to maintain order and prevent escape. Yet even within these parameters, subtle tensions arose. Cultural differences, language barriers, and the sheer dislocation of being uprooted from home created an environment rife with psychological friction. Camp life was regimented, almost military in its structure. Morning roll calls, work assignments, and supervised meals filled the prisoners' days. Guards patrolled barracks, gates, and perimeter fences, watchful, but not cruel. British soldiers, themselves weary from years of conflict, oscillated between strict duty and a human curiosity about their captives. Some approached interactions cautiously, others with a faint, awkward humor. For the German women, accustomed to hierarchical structures and familiar surroundings, this foreign blend of discipline and casual engagement was disorienting. In addition to human oversight, camp logistics imposed further structure. Barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and signaling systems framed the women's movements. Communication was limited, letters were scrutinized, visits from family sparse, and knowledge of the outside world filtered through camp authorities. Despite these restrictions, information flowed. Stories of Allied advances, German defeats, and even local gossip filtered in, shaping perceptions and expectations. Each morning, as women dressed in uniform clothing provided by the camp, they carried not only the weight of their captivity, but also the anticipation of daily encounters with the soldiers overseeing their confinement. The British soldiers themselves were not merely functionaries of war, they were individuals negotiating the same stresses as their prisoners. Though from a position of relative security, many had seen combat, lost friends, or endured long deployments. Their presence within the camps carried dual responsibilities: maintain security and uphold a standard of humane conduct expected by law and morality. Some officers took detailed notes on prisoner behavior, health, and morale. Others observed quietly, aware that every interaction, however minor, could ripple into the psychological landscape of the camp. Thus, when the German women first encountered the British soldiers, they entered a world both foreign and controlled. Every glance, gesture, and movement carried layers of meaning. For soldiers, The sight of women strangers from an enemy nation introduced subtle uncertainties into an otherwise ordered environment. Neither side anticipated that human emotions would quietly, persistently assert themselves amid the structures of wartime containment. The stage was set, not with battlefields or gunfire, but in the tension of shared humanity. The women's reaction, small flushes, hesitant smiles, fleeting gestures were recorded in diaries and memoirs, subtle markers of the psychological interplay between captor and captive. And it was here, in these controlled spaces, that an extraordinary narrative unfolded, one of curiosity, apprehension, and the simple, undeniable force of human presence. As the women continued their first days within the camp, the contrast between expectation and reality became increasingly pronounced. Their understanding of the enemy, shaped by years of propaganda and fear, collided with the reality of British soldiers, young, disciplined, and yet unmistakably human. The nuances of these encounters, small but profound, set the course for the unfolding drama within the camp. As the days unfolded, life inside the camp settled into a rigid rhythm. Barracks were cold, sparsely furnished, and lined with bunks that creaked under the weight of heavy blankets. The women moved quietly, learning quickly which corners were warmer, which gates offered the longest shadows, and which soldiers' glances carried benign curiosity versus strict vigilance. Routine became both shield and confinement. Meals were simple but sufficient: thin soups, bread, and occasionally boiled potatoes. Food, though adequate by Geneva Convention standards, was a reminder of displacement, a tangible marker of the separation from home. Conversations were hushed, often in whispers, for the women still carried a deep awareness of being observed. Yet, within the monotony, moments of subtle human interaction began to surface. A shared glance at the gate, a brief word exchange with a soldier during roll call, small gestures that hinted at recognition of shared humanity. The British soldiers, meanwhile, maintained their formal duties with diligence. Officers conducted inspections, ensured work assignments were completed, and monitored the camp's security apparatus. Beyond these tasks, many soldiers were quietly intrigued by the presence of the women. For some, it was curiosity. For others, a reminder of what life beyond the front lines might resemble. The soldiers' interactions were cautious, never overt, always measured, but the presence of these young, displaced women introduced a psychological complexity into the otherwise orderly routine. Language barriers added another layer of tension and fascination. Few of the women spoke fluent English, and British soldiers rarely spoke German. Communication relied on gestures, simple phrases, and at times, interpreters. Misunderstandings were frequent, yet these moments often became bridges rather than obstacles. A smile, a nod, or a careful imitation of a word could create a connection, however fragile, and every interaction was amplified by the novelty of the situation. The women, for their part, were navigating layers of fear, cultural expectation, and the shock of captivity. Raised in a society structured by rigid norms and hierarchies, they were encountering a version of the enemy entirely unexpected. British soldiers were polite, yet firm, distant, yet observant. Their discipline carried an undercurrent of calm authority, unfamiliar to women accustomed to the chaos and fear of wartime Germany. The subtle differences, mannerisms, posture, the cadence of speech triggered responses that were both instinctive and socially conditioned. Flushing, fleeting eye contact, nervous laughter, these became unintentional markers of emotion, captured in diary entries and letters later analyzed by historians. Cultural contrasts deepened the psychological complexity. The German women carried narratives of a homeland under siege, conditioned by propaganda emphasizing enemy brutality. Yet in the camp, they faced an alternative reality, a disciplined, humane system of containment, where strict rules coexisted with unexpected courtesy. The soldiers' demeanor often defied expectations, challenging preconceived notions and triggering a subtle dissonance between fear and fascination. This period of acclimatization, though quiet on the surface, set the stage for a series of encounters that would define the psychological landscape of the camp. Each glance, each hesitant gesture, contributed to an evolving awareness that war, while brutal and impersonal on battlefields, contained moments of intimate human negotiation, especially in the spaces where captor and captive coexisted daily. By the end of the first weeks, the German women had begun to read the rhythms of the camp. They knew which soldiers were approachable, which corners of the barracks offered relative privacy, and how small actions could signal respect, trust, or caution. The British, similarly, were learning the subtle languages of the women's behavior, nervous smiles, flushed cheeks, fleeting glances that spoke volumes in silence. Within this controlled environment, the human element of war curiosity, tension, and fleeting connection was quietly unfolding. It was here, amidst the frostbitten mornings and regimented routines, that the stage was fully set for the extraordinary dynamics to come, the psychological interplay that would draw soldiers and POWs into an unexpected, human-centered drama. The human dimension of the camp was immediate, intimate, and often understated. For the German women, captivity was a constant negotiation between fear, curiosity, and instinctive self-preservation. Some were young, barely adults, encountering soldiers who were their contemporaries in age, but strangers in every other sense. Their emotional responses blushing, hesitating, averting eyes were not signs of weakness or frivolity, but natural human reactions to unfamiliar social dynamics under extreme stress. These reactions were amplified by cultural and societal conditioning. Many of the women had grown up in structured, hierarchical environments that emphasized discipline, propriety, and restraint. Confronted with British soldiers, they were forced to navigate a space where traditional roles were replaced by camp regulations, themselves foreign yet codified and enforced. Every glance or gesture from a soldier was interpreted through multiple filters: danger, curiosity, social expectation. The tension between instinct and training shaped their daily experiences in ways that no battle report could capture. For the soldiers, the human angle was similarly complex. Trained to maintain discipline, they were instructed to treat prisoners humanely. Yet the presence of women introduced subtle uncertainties. Young men, accustomed to frontline engagements, now faced a situation requiring restraint, observation, and psychological sensitivity. These small, everyday interactions exchanging a word, offering directions, observing behavior became exercises in understanding, empathy, and self-control beyond the personal dynamics. The camp itself functioned as a tactical environment. Its layout, security protocols, and routines were designed not just for containment, but for efficiency and predictability. Barbed wire perimeters, watchtowers, and controlled access points ensured that prisoners remained confined, while enabling soldiers to monitor interactions without constant physical intervention. The presence of women, particularly in segregated sections of the camp, introduced additional logistical considerations. Officers had to balance supervision with humane treatment, ensuring that routines were maintained without provoking unnecessary distress. Guards were instructed to be vigilant, but not intrusive. Every step, patrol, and checkpoint was calculated to maintain order while reducing friction. Even simple tasks escorting prisoners to mess halls, organizing work details, or conducting roll calls required careful planning, as missteps could escalate tensions or inadvertently compromise discipline. Tactical considerations also extended to morale. Observers recognized that the presence of women could affect soldiers' behavior, potentially reducing hostility, but also introducing distractions. Commanders monitored these interactions, noting which soldiers adhered to protocol, which deviated, and how prisoners responded. In this controlled microcosm, the camp itself became a space where human behavior intersected with strategic oversight. A test of both leadership and regulation, leadership within the camp was a careful balancing act. British officers were tasked with enforcing regulations, ensuring security, and maintaining compliance with international law. Yet effective leadership also demanded attentiveness to the nuanced psychological landscape. A misjudged command or overlooked gesture could ripple through the barracks, affecting morale and discipline. Officers observed closely. Some maintained meticulous records of prisoner behavior, noting patterns, interactions, and incidents. Others relied on intuition, adapting routines to minimize tension and encourage cooperation. Leadership was exercised not through aggression, but through measured presence, the quiet authority of a patrol, the even tone of a directive, the patience to allow prisoners to adjust to unfamiliar structures. The women, for their part, interpreted leadership through observation. How officers moved, how soldiers responded, how routines were enforced. All communicated information about expectations, boundaries, and consequences. In many cases, trust developed incrementally. A nod, a brief conversation, or the absence of punitive measures signaled that certain behaviors were permissible, fostering subtle connections within the larger context of captivity. Leadership also extended beyond immediate authority. Senior soldiers and experienced guards acted as intermediaries, modeling behavior for younger recruits and mediating potential conflicts. Their decisions, whether conscious or instinctive, shaped the daily rhythm of camp life, influencing both compliance and emotional responses. In this environment, leadership was not merely functional, it was deeply human, guiding conduct, maintaining security, and allowing space for the psychological dimensions of interaction to emerge. From the German side, the presence of their women captured by the Allies carried both concern and curiosity. German propaganda had long painted British soldiers as rigid, distant, and often harsh, creating expectations of cruelty. Families and local authorities feared for the safety of their captured women, uncertain how they would be treated. Reports from the field described the shock and disbelief of prisoners who encountered soldiers, not as faceless enemies, but as human beings with discipline, humor, and sometimes unexpected kindness. For the women, their understanding of the enemy was in constant tension with lived experience. They had been conditioned to fear, to obey, to distrust. Yet in the camp, they were confronted with individuals who challenged these narratives. A soldier's calm demeanor, willingness to explain a task, or simple courtesy contrasted sharply with the fear instilled by wartime messaging. The enemy, once imagined as a monolithic threat, revealed itself as complex, human, and capable of subtle gestures that carried weight far beyond their intent. The German authorities monitored these dynamics with unease. Letters and reports occasionally noted morale fluctuations among captured personnel. Psychological responses, blushing, hesitation, brief laughter, were interpreted cautiously. While the military recognized the need for compliance, the softer dimensions of interaction were often unpredictable, difficult to control, and from their perspective, potentially compromising. Ethics in the camp were grounded in the Geneva Convention, but moral responsibility extended beyond legality. Officers were acutely aware that treatment of prisoners reflected on the nation as a whole, particularly in a war where public opinion, both domestic and international, could influence strategy. Humane conduct was therefore not merely a legal requirement, it was a moral imperative. For the soldiers, this meant navigating interactions carefully, every decision allowing prisoners a small privilege, responding patiently to confusion. Enforcing rules carried ethical weight. The women's visible emotional responses, including subtle blushing or nervous laughter, were not provocations but reflections of human vulnerability. Leaders instructed guards to observe, not exploit, and to maintain dignity in all engagements. Ethical discipline required restraint, an awareness that the prisoner's humanity was inseparable from their status as captives. From the prisoner's perspective, moral considerations shaped behavior as well. Compliance, respect for routine, and careful observation of boundaries were strategies for safety. Yet they also reflected a recognition of the soldier's ethical stance. This mutual acknowledgement, captives aware of humane treatment, soldiers aware of psychological sensitivity, created a delicate balance. In this controlled environment, ethics became a dynamic force, guiding interactions, shaping trust, and influencing the subtle flow of daily life. Technology in the camp may have been rudimentary compared to battlefields, but it played a subtle role in shaping human interaction. Fences, watchtowers, and signaling systems ensured physical containment, while communication tools, intercoms, coded signals, and patrol routines structured visibility and movement. Every technological element was designed to reduce risk, maintain order, and regulate interactions between prisoners and soldiers. Even minor innovations had psychological impact. Lighting in barracks and along perimeters influenced behavior, creating shadows or points of focus that guided movement. Observation posts allowed officers to monitor without direct interference, enabling subtle surveillance while preserving the dignity of prisoners. Work assignments, sometimes aided by mechanized tools, structured days and minimized idle time, which could otherwise exacerbate tension. Technology also mediated communication between prisoners and officers. Notices posted in common areas, scheduled announcements, and standardized instructions facilitated compliance while limiting confusion. For the women, these tools became part of an unseen architecture of control frameworks they had to learn and navigate. For the soldiers, technology reinforced their authority while allowing a measured distance, reducing confrontational encounters and creating space for observation of behavior, including the small, human gestures that marked the emotional currents of camp life. By February 1945, the rhythm of the camp had grown familiar, yet tension simmered beneath the surface. The German women had learned the routines, roll calls, work details, and mealtimes, but each day still carried the possibility of unexpected encounters. It was during these ordinary moments that extraordinary psychological dynamics emerged. One morning, as frost clung to the barracks windows and the wind rattled the eaves, a group of women lined up for roll call. British soldiers stood at attention, faces impassive yet observant. Among the prisoners, a young nurse, recently transferred from a frontline auxiliary unit, could not suppress the subtle flush rising to her cheeks at the gaze of a tall, quiet corporal. His presence was commanding, yet devoid of aggression. He simply observed, a small ledger tucked under one arm, noting names and details. For her, and others nearby, the human tension was palpable, a collision of fear, curiosity, and instinctive recognition of shared humanity. Elsewhere in the camp, interactions became more nuanced. Work details, assigned for cleaning, maintenance, or kitchen support, placed women and soldiers in close proximity for extended periods. A soldier offering instructions, pointing to a corner to sweep or a table to scrub, triggered responses beyond compliance. Eyes met briefly, gestures lingered, and small smiles, almost imperceptible, became exchanges loaded with unspoken meaning. These were not moments of overt romance or impropriety, but rather subtle, human acknowledgments, a fleeting recognition of presence, individuality, and vulnerability. Commanders, aware of these interactions, maintained vigilance without heavy-handed interference. They understood that controlling behavior entirely was impossible. The human element, shaped by prolonged exposure, curiosity, and social conditioning, would assert itself regardless of rules. Officers recorded observations in daily logs, noting which soldiers remained composed and which displayed signs of distraction or emotional engagement. For the prisoners, these behaviors were equally observable. Measured attentiveness or casual gestures communicated information about boundaries, authority, and permissible conduct. The psychological pressure intensified during communal activities. Mealtime in the mess hall, a routine meant for efficiency, became a stage for heightened awareness. The hum of conversation, the clatter of utensils, and the rhythmic stamping of boots created a sensory backdrop, against which small gestures stood out. A glance across a long table, a shared laugh at a mispronounced word, or the careful handing of a ladle could become charged with unspoken meaning. The women, trained to observe and anticipate, navigated these moments with caution, noting which soldiers adhered to discipline, which allowed glimpses of personality, and which moments could be safely reciprocated. A particularly striking instance occurred during a supervised outing within the camp's yard. The women, tasked with maintenance work along the fences, encountered a squad of soldiers conducting inspection. Movement was slow, methodical. A young corporal, noting a slight hesitation from one prisoner, offered a brief, encouraging word, its tone calm, neutral, yet human. The effect was immediate. Tension eased, shoulders relaxed, and a small cluster of women exchanged quiet glances, acknowledging the subtle kindness. Such gestures, repeated across days and weeks, accumulated significance. They highlighted the extraordinary interplay of authority and empathy, fear and curiosity, discipline and human instinct. At the same time, external pressures shaped the internal climate. News of Allied advances in Europe, communicated through letters or camp bulletins, reminded prisoners and soldiers alike of the broader war beyond the fences. The women were acutely aware of their displacement, the uncertainty of return, and the ongoing conflict that had brought them to this point. Soldiers, too, carried fatigue, anxiety, and a sense of responsibility not just for enforcement, but for the psychological well-being of those in their charge. These overlapping pressures intensified every glance, gesture, and interaction. It was in these moments, the quiet, seemingly mundane routines, that the camp's true psychological drama unfolded. The intensity did not derive from combat or confrontation, but from the collision of human instincts and wartime discipline. Fear, curiosity, and respect coexisted, producing fleeting, electrified moments that historians would later recognize as markers of human resilience and adaptability. The interactions, subtle yet profound, demonstrated that even in captivity, human connection could assert itself, quietly reshaping relationships, expectations, and behavior within the camp. The stage was now set for the pivotal turning point, a series of events in which these quiet tensions would crystallize, revealing both the limits of control and the enduring force of human emotion. March 1945 arrived with a brittle dawn, the frost lingering longer across the barracks and yard. Daily routines continued, but a subtle shift had emerged. The interactions between soldiers and the German, Women POWs were no longer merely cautious exchanges. They had intensified into moments charged with heightened awareness and human tension. On one particular morning, during a routine inspection of the camp's east wing, a group of women was tasked with laundry and cleaning duties. A senior corporal, known for his even temperament and methodical approach, moved among them, issuing instructions. His presence was neutral, professional, yet he maintained a quiet attentiveness that prisoners quickly noticed. A young nurse, standing slightly apart, hesitated as she reached for a wash bucket. The corporal offered a small nod, a gesture of recognition that was at once subtle and commanding. The woman's cheeks flushed not from embarrassment, but from the stark realization of being observed as a person rather than merely a captive. Nearby prisoners mirrored the same reactions, their glances fleeting but charged with emotion. Similar patterns emerged during work details in the kitchens and storerooms. Tasks required close proximity, repeated eye contact, and coordinated effort. Soldiers demonstrated efficiency and patience, offering guidance without condescension. The women responded with compliance, but also with subtle signs of self-awareness, adjusted posture, careful attention to expression, and a measured responsiveness that reflected both fear and curiosity. For observers, these interactions revealed a remarkable interplay of restraint and instinct and unspoken negotiation in which human emotion coexisted with the rigid frameworks of captivity. One of the most telling moments occurred during a brief outdoor exercise. Prisoners and soldiers walked along a cleared path for physical inspection. The wind carried the scent of wet soil and smoke from distant chimneys. A group of women, tasked with carrying firewood, crossed paths with a small squad of soldiers. A corporal, without speaking, tilted his head slightly in acknowledgement of their effort. The gesture was simple, almost imperceptible, yet it had immediate effect. The women exchanged glances, shoulders relaxed, and a sense of mutual recognition filled the moment. This exchange, though small, epitomized the human tension that had developed a delicate balance between authority, observation, and the assertion of personal presence. Commanders observed these interactions closely, documenting behavior, morale, and deviations from routine. Daily logs noted which soldiers maintained strict professional distance, and which allowed subtle engagement. Officers reflected on the unpredictability of human response. Blushing, laughter, hesitation, and fleeting smiles became measurable indicators of psychological adaptation, not rebellion. Soldiers were reminded that humane conduct and careful observation were essential. A single misstep could disrupt order or escalate tensions simultaneously. News from the front reminded prisoners and guards alike that the war was nearing its conclusion. Allied advances in Europe were accelerating. German defenses were collapsing, and the uncertainty of homecoming or punishment loomed over every decision. The women's behavior reflected this dual awareness, cautious curiosity tempered by fear of consequences, and fleeting moments of human connection intensified by the knowledge that their captivity might soon end. Soldiers, too, were influenced by these developments, balancing the demands of duty with the recognition of their captive's vulnerability. A particularly decisive incident involved a group of women temporarily assigned to sorting supplies. In the central warehouse, their task required them to work closely with several soldiers, coordinating movement of crates and equipment. One young prisoner, previously hesitant and reserved, met the gaze of a corporal directly. He offered a concise, calm instruction, then paused a deliberate, silent acknowledgement of her effort. The moment, though brief, crystallized weeks of subtle psychological tension. Prisoners recognized the humanity of their overseers. Soldiers observed the genuine emotional responses of the captives, and the camp's routines became infused with an unprecedented, quiet intimacy. These events, though devoid of violence or overt confrontation, represented the climax of human dynamics within the camp. They illustrated that the most profound turning points in wartime captivity were not always measured by strategy or firepower, but by psychological shifts, the acknowledgement of individuality, the emergence of trust, and the negotiation of boundaries between fear and curiosity. By the end of March, observers noted a pattern. Prisoners moved with a cautious confidence. Soldiers interacted with measured attentiveness, and the overall climate of the camp reflected the culmination of months of adaptation. What had begun as simple compliance and regimented behavior had evolved into complex, human-centered interactions. The turning point was not marked by a single event, but by the accumulation of these moments, gestures, glances, and subtle acknowledgments that define the lived reality of both captives and captors. With spring approaching, the atmosphere within the camp shifted from rigid routine to a quieter, reflective order. The interactions that had reached their climax left subtle, yet tangible, effects on both prisoners and soldiers. For the German women, the realization that British soldiers were disciplined yet human introduced a complex mixture of relief, curiosity, and cautious respect. The initial tension of fear gradually softened, replaced by an awareness of shared humanity in the midst of conflict. Daily routines became infused with this awareness. Women approached tasks with careful attention, not only to comply with camp regulations, but also to navigate the nuances of interaction with soldiers. Roll calls, work assignments, and mealtimes, once sources of anxiety, now included fleeting moments of acknowledgement, a nod, a polite word, or a measured smile. These small gestures did not compromise discipline, but they reshaped the social fabric of the camp, introducing trust where suspicion had once dominated. For British soldiers, the consequences were equally significant. The weeks of observation and interaction honed their understanding of human psychology. Under captivity, officers reported in logs that prisoners demonstrated increasing composure, adaptability, and subtle emotional expression. Soldiers who had initially maintained rigid professional distance now found themselves exercising restraint with heightened awareness, recognizing that even minor gestures could profoundly influence prisoner behavior. The cumulative effect was a camp climate that balanced order with empathy, a model of humane conduct. Under extreme conditions, leadership responded with careful acknowledgement of these developments. Commanders encouraged adherence to protocol while allowing space for appropriate human interaction. Officers recognized that morale on both sides was strengthened not through coercion, but through respectful engagement. Reports highlighted improvements in cooperation, efficiency in work details, and a decline in minor infractions. The psychological impact of recognition and humane treatment, though intangible, was measurable in the smooth operation of the camp and the apparent well-being of the prisoners. From the perspective of the German authorities, these developments were more difficult to quantify, but no less notable. Letters, intercepted communications, and post-war memoirs indicated that prisoners' morale, while affected by captivity, was not irreparably damaged. Observers noted that women adjusted to routines, maintained dignity, and demonstrated resilience, attributes shaped as much by the behavior of their captors as by personal fortitude. The interplay of fear, curiosity, and subtle human connection left a lasting impression, one that would be reflected in accounts and recollections long after the war. Ethical and moral considerations also manifested in the aftermath. The British adherence to the Geneva Convention, combined with measured, humane interactions, demonstrated that compliance with international law could coexist with meaningful psychological engagement. Officers and soldiers had navigated a delicate balance, maintaining authority, while allowing prisoners space to assert individuality. The success of this approach reinforced principles of ethical conduct that would influence subsequent discussions of prisoner treatment in both military and historical contexts. Technological and logistical systems, which had structured daily life, continued to support these outcomes. Observation posts, communication tools, and carefully designed routines ensured security without intruding on the emerging human dimension. The infrastructure allowed subtle observation of behavior, enabling officers to make informed decisions while minimizing unnecessary confrontation. In this way, technology reinforced the ethical and psychological frameworks that define the post-climax environment. By mid-spring, the camp had evolved into a space where discipline, observation, and human interaction coexisted in an extraordinary balance. The women had learned to navigate their emotions, understand the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and engage with soldiers in ways that preserved dignity and safety. Soldiers, in turn, had gained insight into human psychology, the impact of humane conduct, and the subtle power of recognition and restraint. These immediate consequences laid the foundation for broader reflections on captivity, human behavior, and the ethical responsibilities of wartime authority. They created conditions in which subsequent interactions, historical accounts, and post-war narratives could be understood not only in terms of logistics or policy, but through the lens of shared human experience. As 1945 progressed and the war neared its end, the experiences within the camp continued to resonate, both for the German women and for the British soldiers. Liberation was approaching, yet the lessons of months spent in close, controlled proximity endured. Prisoners had developed not only routines, but nuanced understandings of human behavior under duress. They had learned to navigate fear, to recognize authority balanced with empathy, and to respond to gestures that spoke more than words could convey. For many of the women, the most enduring impact was psychological. Diaries and post-war memoirs reveal a mixture of relief, lingering anxiety, and profound reflection. Some expressed surprise at the humanity of the soldiers, a realization that challenged previously held narratives of the enemy. Others noted that small acts, an encouraging word, a quiet nod, an acknowledgement of effort had left lasting impressions, shaping perceptions of fairness, morality, and the complex nature of human interaction during conflict. These insights were as significant as any tactical lesson, revealing that captivity did not erase individuality or emotional intelligence, but instead provided a framework for its subtle expression for the British soldiers. The consequences extended beyond the camp gates. Officers reflected on the balance between authority and empathy, recognizing that humane treatment could enhance discipline, efficiency, and morale simultaneously. Many soldiers carried forward lessons about leadership, observation, and ethical conduct that informed later postings and influenced post-war approaches to prisoner management. The camp became, in retrospect, a microcosm of the broader ethical challenges of warfare: how to assert control without dehumanizing, how to enforce order while respecting the dignity of those under authority. Historically, the events of the camp hold significance beyond individual experience. They illustrate the complex interplay between human psychology and wartime discipline, the subtle influence of morality in operational environments, and the potential for empathy to shape outcomes even in the context of captivity. Observers and historians have noted that such camps, when administered with fairness and measured oversight, can mitigate the psychological toll of imprisonment and foster unexpected resilience in prisoners. The experiences of the German women and their British captors provide a compelling case study in this dynamic, offering insight into both human behavior and the practical application of international law. The ethical dimension of these interactions also reverberates in post-war discourse. The Geneva Convention, while legalistic in nature, was given human texture through everyday conduct. Soldiers' adherence to humane treatment paired with an awareness of prisoners' emotional states demonstrated that law and morality were not abstract concepts, but practical tools shaping daily life. Prisoners' responses, in turn, highlighted the power of recognition, respect, and subtle social signaling in mitigating fear and fostering cooperation. Together, these factors reveal a moral architecture that underpinned the operation of POW camps, leaving lessons for future military engagements and humanitarian standards. In personal and historical accounts alike, liberation is often described as both relief and revelation. Prisoners departed with memories not only of confinement, but of moments of unexpected human connection. Soldiers, in turn, recalled the quiet tension and subtle exchanges that had defined their duties. These experiences would be recounted in letters, diaries, and later historical analyses, providing a window into the ordinary yet extraordinary human dimensions of war. By the time the last prisoners departed, the camp had been transformed from a site of fear and uncertainty into a space of structured human engagement. The events that unfolded, their small gestures, fleeting glances, and measured interactions had lasting consequences, influencing both immediate morale and long-term historical understanding. They underscored that even within systems designed for control, human nature asserts itself, and that compassion, restraint, and observation are as powerful as any regulation or directive. In the quiet aftermath of captivity, the experiences of the German women and British soldiers reveal a profound truth about human nature. In times of war, beyond strategy, artillery, and conquest, war leaves its deepest mark in the spaces where people must coexist under stress, uncertainty, and authority. In the controlled environment of the POW camp, ordinary gestures, a nod, a measured word, a fleeting glance became vessels of meaning, shaping behavior, morale, and perception in ways that no battlefield could. The camp demonstrates that the human psyche is resilient, adaptable, and perceptive. The women, displaced and uncertain, navigated fear and curiosity with instinctive intelligence. The soldiers, trained for combat yet tasked with humane oversight, exercised discipline tempered by empathy. Together, they engaged in a silent dialogue, one that transcended nationality, ideology, and the boundaries of conflict. It was a conversation expressed in small, tangible acts, the acknowledgement of effort, the respect for personal space, the recognition of emotion. Historically, these interactions underscore the importance of ethics and humane conduct in wartime. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but it was the conscientious application of those principles that gave them life. Leadership, observation, and moral awareness created an environment where order and humanity could coexist. This delicate balance, sustained over months, offers enduring lessons for military conduct and the treatment of prisoners. That authority is most effective when guided by respect, and that dignity need not be sacrificed for discipline beyond policy. The story holds a timeless human resonance. Even amid conflict, connection, recognition, and subtle empathy endure. They remind us that war is not solely a story of destruction, but also of the persistent, unspoken interplay of humanity. The blush of a prisoner, the careful nod of a soldier, moments so small they might be overlooked carry profound significance, revealing that in every act of war, there remains a space for humanity to assert itself. In this way, the camp becomes more than a historical footnote. It stands as a testament to the quiet, persistent power of human behavior, illustrating that even in captivity, empathy, respect, and recognition can flourish, and that these small, ordinary acts often leave the most extraordinary legacies. If this journey into the hidden stories of WWII captivated you, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe for more cinematic, real history documentaries that reveal the human side of war. Share your thoughts or reflections in the comments below. How did the courage and resilience of these posts strike you?